Okay, our next presenter is Philip Cass from Otago Polytechnic here in Dunedin. I think you're in Dunedin at the moment, Phil. You'll have to, yep, that's it.
No, I am actually at Otago Polytechnic, Auckland International Campus.
You're up in Auckland.
I'm in the Queen Street campus, or in this bloody armchair for the past 3 months of lockdown teaching.
Yes, of course. Well, we'll hope that all sorts itself out soon. But
yeah, I don't think
Philip,
we'll be back teaching in class till next year.
Well, Philip's presentation, Tongan and Fijian diasporic media and its influence on island politics. So over to you, Philip.
I'm going to try and not run for too long on this one. I read the whole thing onto the website, and it was clocking in at 30 minutes, which is catatonia inducing. So basically what this is, it's an introduction to a much broader study of the role of social media in the Pacific and among diasporic communities. Grows out of some of my earlier work on the influence of social media on the 2014 Tongan elections. So it's a work in progress. It makes some assumptions, but there are certainly areas where a lot more needs to be done. Okay, so let's begin then. Social media obviously plays an important role in politics, social interactions, and in exacerbating problems surrounding health and in exploiting vulnerable communities. So what I'm going to do in this, I'm going to be looking at the social and political roles of online media in Tonga and Fiji and among their diasporic communities in Auckland. Now, the media themselves may be referred to as diasporic since they provide the networks that keep various communities linked. It may be assumed that there is a high degree of probability that members of a number of diasporic communities in different countries will participate in online debates. So Auckland, as we know, is home to several Pacific communities. Some, like the Tongan ones, are well established, others are very small scale. Also home to a vibrant Pacific media scene, largely concentrated around radio and online sources, but also with local newspapers, some of which still survive. Okay, so online media serve as a conduit for local news and information and for making international connections. Previous research has shown that islanders keep in touch with relatives in their country of origin via the new technology, and that the diasporic communities play a very active role in areas like politics and influencing community development at home and abroad. Even if they can't vote directly, they have a massive influence. So there's also a notion of double identity, as people are simultaneously seeing themselves as Tongans and New Zealanders, or as Fijians and New Zealanders, but that's also another matter for debate. So these connections automatically create a globalized public sphere, or public spheres, plural, in which Facebook groups have memberships in several countries, all of whom can be expected to comment and to spread information or disinformation. However, what's also happened is that at times politicians have attempted to control these online narratives, especially at election times. But as we'll see, there are times when the narratives have escaped control completely. So people from the islands have begun to use places like Auckland as metropolitan centres from where they can participate in democratic processes and taking part in their own culturally adapted versions of parliamentary democracy. Now, this is also helped by the fact that island politicians also have family connections and sometimes second homes. In New Zealand, the late Akalisi Pahiva, for instance, used Auckland as a refuge and an overseas power base during his struggles. And politicians are particularly aware of the power and influence of the Auckland diaspora, wooing them during election campaigns, even if, as with the Tongan community, they can't actually vote. Fijians have been heavy users of Facebook and other media. There's been a lot of work done around the work or the influence of media on elections. Fijian politicians, past and present, have used New Zealand or recognized its importance. Prime Minister Bainimarama came out in 2014 to speak to Fijians living in Auckland. Former Fijian Prime Minister Sitiveni Rabuka, I remember, turned up at the Pacific Conference on Democracy at Canterbury in 2012. And both Sandra Kalahi and Kalino Latu have attributed the influence of Tongans in Auckland to the importance of their remittances to the kingdom economy and their influence politically. So, first part of this presentation, I'm going to be looking at two recent cases involving social media among the Tongan community. One involving the community in Auckland and the community in the United States. Okay, just remember the Tongan diasporic community spreads from Sydney to Salt Lake City. And the other one is about online media in Tonga and influences from the outside. So, Tongan audience in Auckland is served by homegrown media, including social media, news services operating in other countries, including the US and Tonga itself. Online services include Geneva News, which veteran journalist Kalafi Mawala described as the second most prominent website after Pisi Fonua's Matangi Tonga. Geneva has been part of my life since 2013. I worked for them as a proofreader and journalist and editorial advisor. Kalafi Mawala, in his own particular manner, talking about the internet and internet news, said that it allowed anybody who could access online communication to be an information source and provider without too much care for the quality of the information given. He said it gave immediate access and dissemination of information with the capability of going viral. And he said it also created a feeling of euphoria and perhaps a mythical sense of self-significance and freedom in being able to communicate whatever you thought was important. I want you to keep those qualifications of Kalafi's in mind. So the Tongan media suffers from its number of aggregator sites, sources print unsupported stories, and all media rely on the internet for news and ideas. You know, we're told that it's a bad thing to rely on Facebook for news stories, but in fact, Facebook is a major source of news stories in the Tongan media, or many parts of it. And this might be frowned on in the West, but as my boss, Kalino Latu, points out, news stories break on Facebook in Tonga precisely because that's how the politicians and their supporters want it. Okay, and basically they prefer to use social media, according to Lino, instead of the mainstream media, because they can release information whenever and however they want. This allows them to control what's said, and some of the most vicious political infighting you've ever seen turns up on Facebook pages in Tongan. And as Lino says, they can post whatever they want. There's no fact checking. There's no repercussions. People say one thing, people say another thing. It all blows up out of hand. And if they don't like the way you report on them, then they attack the source. You know, Geneva, we've been attacked regularly. But as Lino says, you know, these attacks tend to come from very high-profile people, and that's largely because they're supporters of the old pre-democratic system. So, one thing which I think nobody quite keeps in mind Is it a service like Caneva because it's diasporic, because it's serving several communities? My goodness, Vali, you're taking too many notes. I'm very worried now. One thing I'd like people to keep in mind is that if you're a source like Caneva, you have to keep an eye on libel laws in New Zealand and in Tonga. And without going into any details, let me say that we are aware that some very powerful people in Tonga retain lawyers in Auckland. So some stories. First one is interesting. It's about COVID. As you may know, Tongan government, which has been utterly lackadaisical in bringing RSE workers back home, had a repatriation flight into Nuku'alofa at the end of last month. That included some RSE workers. One of the people on the flight got a week positive and was quarantined. And because it was a week positive, it all had to be redone and it took a couple of days and he was shifted around. Well, this all went online and there was huge array of commentary from people in Tonga and people in Auckland, and nobody knew how this information was leaking out until it turned out that this guy had his mobile phone with him. And what he was doing was he was phoning up his relatives and going, hey, these people don't know what they're talking about. They say this, they say this. I saw this on the news. And these stories get amplified, distorted, spread all over the place. And it becomes a real headache. And the CEO of the health ministry said, yeah, he should have been told not to talk to anybody, which was, not going to work. And this all blew up into a situation where there was a big press conference and a journalist at the conference asked the Prime Minister, what he was going to do about it. Now, the CEO of the health ministry had already said that he had tried really hard to not let any details out to protect the patient's privacy. Fair enough, except that the journalist at the conference, he said, look, there's massive social concerns. What's the government going to do about it? At that point, the Prime Minister, Pohiva Tuanatoa, said that he just got a message on his mobile phone and was not very happy with what he'd got. And it's very interesting that what he appears to have got in the middle of the press conference was a copy of the video clip showing the patient in hospital talking to his family and saying many uncomplimentary things about the Tongan Health Service. So here you've got a situation where the Prime Minister is basically being hijacked by Facebook in the middle of a press conference about the situation. And as far as I've been able to deduce, people chiming in on this conversation were in Tonga, but also because the flight was from Christchurch, you've also got people from New Zealand pitching into it. So that instead of being, and because naturally of the connection with the two countries, the entire thing becomes, this globalized sphere in which you can't have the patient locked down in his hospital bed, not talking to anybody. It turns into a conversation that in fact jumps between both countries and makes the Prime Minister very cross in the middle of a press conference. And I've always wondered which person thought it was amusing to send the Prime Minister a copy of that clip smack in the middle of the press conference, because that was also manipulation. So then what happened, and this is where it gets down to a level where it's really personalized. Somebody released the patient's name. Somebody released information about where the patient's family came from, and they were immediately targeted on Facebook. Because, it's a shameful thing. And this apparently goes back to the days when, there were leprosy outbreaks, and if your family had leprosy, everybody would point the finger at you and go, oh, you're diseased. And this was the same thing. So Facebook in this sense, and you know, we're looking at it as a global thing, but it comes right down to family levels. It comes right down to people in the villages being picked on because of these incidents. And in fact, somebody from the family contacted Caneva News and said eventually they'd got an apology out of the person over this. But the consequences of this are fairly devastating. And the reason I've picked on this one is because while COVID is a global issue and it's going to raise global concerns and questions and comments, it also comes right down to that very local level. And it feeds in both directions. Hang on. What the hell?
Yeah, Philip, we probably got about another 5 minutes.
That's right. You're going to get another 5 minutes. I'm sorry. I was giving you the short version. Okay. All right. Well, listen. The other one from Tonga I just wanted to talk about briefly was a situation where people here in Auckland were being scammed by a member of their own community working on Facebook and online, living in the US. But we'll go into more detail on that one. The other one I would talk about just briefly then, if I'm running out of time. Okay, the other one I would talk about very briefly, it's also COVID. And I'm just going to come straight out and say, this is actually coming out of the last issue of Pacific Journalism Review. There's just been a really good report coming out looking at what's happened with online sources and Facebook sources in Fiji, spreading massive amounts of disinformation about COVID and about vaccinations and all the other stuff. And what's really interesting is when you analyze the material, and I'm using the information that's been given, but coming at it from a slightly different angle from the original authors. If you look at an awful lot of the material that's been coming out and being planted or infiltrated into the Fijian context, it's all clearly coming from the outside, and it's all clearly stuff that's coming out of the US. Now, this stuff's circulating fairly freely. To me, from what I've seen, it looks as if a lot of it has been planted in the midst of conversations. One of the things I want to do in terms of future research on this is to try to pinpoint where this stuff is coming from by going back into and further analyzing the Facebook pages and seeing how much of this stuff is coming in from US sources, because there is obviously a Fijian diaspora debating these things. And I really want to see how much of this stuff is being deliberately injected. I mean, you can pick up stuff and you can just pick up general crazy conspiracy theory stuff, but a lot of this stuff seems to be fairly targeted. And what I've been looking at reminds me of the stuff we've been getting in our letterboxes here in Auckland from anti-vaxxer groups, which is quite clearly American, but just with a New Zealand, you know, address on it. And it looks to me as if a lot of the stuff that's being slotted into these Facebook pages in Fiji is coming in the same way. It's being localized and then just slotted in. Especially since a lot of the stuff just isn't actually relevant in any way to the particular Fijian context that we're going. The Fijians also had the same thing with people releasing names of patients and targeting and vilifying families as well. So I'm going to stop there because I'm where I am now massively over time, and I should probably stop. But I think this is all fairly fascinating, but certainly it's work for much more research and nailing down things. But I think there's an awful lot of questions that could be asked.
Right, that's great. Thank you very much, Philip.
Thank you.
So if you look at all the clapping.
Yes, okay, Valia's clapping now. You shamed her into clapping. She stopped taking notes down.
Well, that was wonderful. I mean, your exposition of Tongan media offered another example of the many different approaches and many different disciplinary approaches taken towards migration, also taken towards islands, and those different paradigms that one can approach the same topic, but in different disciplinary ways, often multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. So thank you very much for that. You brought out the notion of double identity. Of course, there are many multiple identities in many diaspora groups. And the dangers, and you warned of the dangers of Facebook, but also looking at the, the positive and negative effects of it, and it being a major source of Tongan media, which I find quite fascinating, and how a government is using, an international, well, an American-based social media giant to manipulate its own message.
Yeah, see, when I did my original paper on the 2014 election in Tonga, and I was looking at the influence from here, I must admit, when I looked at it, I was seeing it as people from here using the media to connect there as if it was something separate, as if the diasporic media was something separate. But I've now come round to the view that, in fact, it's all diasporic media. It can't be, you cannot separate it, because when you look at, well, things like the pyramid scam I was looking at, that's American, but victims in Australia and New Zealand and the US, plus a local base and a warehouse here. So, it just makes me think that, in fact, trying to separate it into diasporic media and local media, and I'm not even going to say home country media, because clearly people feel they're both Tongan and New Zealander, but in fact that you have to look at it as all being diasporic. It's all one community media. They're just, people happen to be geographically separated by several thousand miles.
Yeah, fascinating. Were there any questions? Yuki, you go for it.
Perhaps this actually leads into Marion's presentation, but in the context of Samoa, we have two telecommunications companies. One is Vodafone, and the other one is Blue Sky. And the thing about when you actually sign up to these two telecommunications, like, when you buy like an iPhone or whatever, is that, once when you sign up, you have immediate access to Facebook and other kinds of social media outlets. Now, when I signed up to Blue Sky, okay, so buy this data and you get automatic access to Facebook, but there were also other social media channels that I've never heard of that came out of the Caribbean. Therefore, because they are social media companies, because they are global telecommunications company that are targeting the global South, and I think that the availability of social media at the moment that you actually buy a cell phone, in the islands, I think also fuels the social media engagement, and particularly to Facebook and TikTok, actually, but not so much Instagram in Samoa. Yeah, and then so I just wondered, whether maybe perhaps this fueling of Tongan engagement with social media is also fueled by the cell phone telecommunication companies, making Facebook as the primary social media channel for engagement. So I think there's more global corporation impact that kind of trickles down from top bottom in behavior of how people in the islands or people, those of us in the global South, engage with social media?
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. I'll have to find out about that. Of course, it's also a way of generating massive amounts of money for the company, because people will use up all of their time very rapidly if they're on Facebook all the time and have to buy even more credits. So yeah, but thank you. That's a really good idea.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, so sorry, in Samoa, everybody, including my mother, they both had a Vodafone and a Blue Sky phone. And then they both have, because you know how like when you establish a Facebook account, one phone, one Facebook account, but my mother also has like a Blue Sky one with a different Facebook account. So, many islanders kind of live like double lives, because of how amount of phones that, that you get. Yeah, I just thought I'd just drop that in as a comment.
Thank you. That's a brilliant idea. I'll check that one out.
Okay, one more quick question and a quick answer, then we'll move on. Marianne.
Just to add on to that, what Yuki is saying, I think you're talking about Digicel and Blue Sky. So Digicel is Irish and Caribbean owned, and a lot of the Pacific in Samoa is because they've got different specials. So if you don't have a phone, you have a different SIM card, right? So when I was doing my research there was the free nights where 6 p.m. to midnight, there was this, was it midnight to 6 a.m. there was no charge, so it was free data. And so obviously, all the naughty things happened at nighttime in the VAR, the digital VAR, however else you want to explain it. But it's really interesting. I think you're right, Yuki, in terms of you talk about capitalism, commercialization of the communication between people. They're being very savvy about that.
Yeah, and Phil, you might have already looked at the work of Heather Horst, who's done extensive research on mobile impact in the Pacific and the Caribbean, and you can see the connection as well. Extensive publication in that space, so you might find her a useful reference. Yeah.
Okay, let's give Philip another round of applause. Thank you for your presentation, Philip.